As you know, it's Friday evening. It's a bit thin, but numbers doesn't really make a difference. We're all hoping all of you are going to ask a question, so that'll make no difference if there are a few people. So anyway, let's get started. So this is the panel discussion, the final session of the symposium. We will obviously conclude after this. So the motivation behind this panel symposium and the sort of questions that have come about, and many of you may know, Momo and I wrote some questions first, and we also asked the audience to write their questions during the course of the symposium based on the discussions that came from many of the talks the keynote speakers gave, many of the presentations that some of the audience members gave, and then also there's another way, which is directly take questions from the floor. So this is sort of where the questions are going to come from. What we can do, I think, is maybe go through our panelists first, ask them to introduce and keep it very short. Say where you're from, your affiliation, and what you're doing with this. You want me to start? Yeah, sure.
Hello, my name is Bob Grimm. I'm the director of the Do Good Institute at the University of Maryland. I'm also the Levinson Family Chair in Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland.
I don't think I need a microphone. My name is Lisa Bender. I work with UNICEF in our New York global headquarters. And what I do for good is I coordinate a reading program at a homeless shelter, and I'm also a foster parent.
Hi, I'm Neville Hogan. I'm a professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at MIT. I'm also a professor in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT, and I direct the Newman Laboratory for Biomechanics and Human Rehabilitation.
I'm Brad Rein, and I'm a National Science Liaison with the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And what I do good, I think I'm going to go back to one of the programs that I've always appreciated since I started it back in 1990. And it's a program to help farmers with disabilities. And it's called Agribility. And I think University of Maryland set a grant to funded over 35 universities or states around the country. We've probably helped over 16,000 farmers stay in the job of their choice. So that's one of my favorites, and I've always held it very close.
I am Matt Scassero. I'm the director of the University of Maryland Unmanned Aircraft System Test Site. Two things that we do good. First is we don't crash drones on people. That's a really good do-good thing. And the second thing is we allow students, faculty, other people that we work with to get their ideas airborne, and get their ideas to take off.
So, one more
Oh, myself? My name is Mary Shu. I am faculty in aerospace engineering here with a joint appointment with the Institute for Systems Research. I do a lot of work with the Robotics Center and autonomy and controls and verification.
Okay, and Momo is program co-chair, and I'm the other program co-chair. My name is Raj Madhavan. I'm with the Maryland Robotics Center. My areas of interest are primarily in technology for good and policy considerations of emerging technologies. So on that note, I want to start off by thanking you all for being here, especially our keynote speakers. Thank you for staying back, and thank you for giving the keynote. It's been an interesting symposium. We're obviously doing it for the first time, so we didn't know quite what to expect and what kind of feedback we'll receive. One thing I've repeatedly heard from the audience, just talking with people who are not here, many of them, is that the symposium is unique in the sense it covers a very wide set of topics. That I heard over and over and over again, and I think that's a very positive feedback for us, because especially if you go in robotics or control or any particular field, it becomes like very narrow very quickly, and that's how conferences are set up. So I think this is a very good strength of this symposium. It's kind of covering not everything, but pretty wide set of activities, wide set of research, and all unified under the theme of doing good. So I think that's a good strength of the symposium. On that note, we will go through some of the questions that people wrote, and the common denominator in those questions, which is, I think, essentially very well distilled in this question. And I'm just going to read the question, and maybe the person who wrote this is also here. We don't know who wrote it, but so the question that I would like to ask, or the person who wrote this would like to ask the panelists, is can we discuss what we mean when we say social good, and what is not social good? How do we ensure that what we build actually serves people and not just profit? So I think that's a very generic but a very important question because it is a Do Good Robotics Symposium. After all, we are not going to particularly pick one person to answer unless we think we would like some person to start it off, and that happens to be true with this question. So I'm actually going to ask Bob. Bob, as he introduced himself as the director of the Do Good Institute, so he can definitely talk about this and maybe say a few words also about how some of the programs you've been involved in and what Do Good and social good means for you.
Yeah, so it's my pleasure. Well, I was going to not use the mic because it seems like, but I can. But I don't think, I've never been described as not loud enough. So I think I'll be all right. I mean, what I think I will say about what is doing good, what is social impact, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think are some of the qualities, which I've also heard in some of the sessions today, which is, doing good or making a social impact is a lot harder than it looks. And that's something that, your keynote, I think, emphasized as well. So what are some of the qualities that I think are needed in order to try to make a social impact? One is, I think you need to figure out what are you passionate about. Because any issue that you really want to make an impact on, it's not going to be easy. You're going to face setbacks. You're going to have challenges. If you're passionate about it, you're going to be more resilient. You're going to be more persistent. Secondly, good intentions aren't enough in trying to make a social impact. In fact, you can have good intentions and actually make things worse. I've had the benefit of going and speaking in a number of engineering for social change classes that we have in the Clark School of Engineering. And in those classes, students actually have thousands of dollars to actually invest in some kind of engineering effort outside the university that's looking to make an impact. And early on, I come into them and I tell them that you need to not assume that just because your intentions are good, you won't make things worse. And we've heard that a number of times as themes in the symposium. And I actually joke with them that you don't want to go home at the end of your semester of having a class called Engineering for Social Change, and you ask your parents say, what did you do? And you said, I took a class where I made people's lives worse. All right? But I'm saying that because it's a lot harder to actually make a real impact. And how do you make a real impact? One is constantly questioning your assumptions, constantly bringing in diverse, different perspectives into the work you're doing. Illustrating, I think, the art of adaptation and constantly learning and evolving, not assuming that you have the solution to what you're doing. And if you take some of these qualities, I'm going to hit a few of them, I think that you have a better shot of making social impact. And then what I'll tell you just a little bit about the Do Good Institute, we work to build what we call pioneering a new approach to education here at the University of Maryland called the Do Good Campus. Our desire is to engage all students, every background, in experiences inside and outside the classroom that empowers them to take whatever they're passionate about and provide them with skills and experiences that allow them to change the world today. And we've been very fortunate to have multiple recent alums who, for example, have created leading companies that are addressing ugly produce. So, for example, if you've heard of U-shaped carrots, this will be the last thing I'll say, Raj, because I'm probably talking too long. If you've heard of U-shaped carrots, all right, we have multiple alums who basically have created companies to address the fact that there are billions and billions of dollars of billions of pounds of food that goes to waste every year because it's viewed as cosmetically inappropriate for the grocery store, right? And so they, basically students with the right skills, these are students who are in their 20s, have created companies that are selling ugly produce, they're reducing food waste, and they create over 100,000 new jobs with their effort and save 50 million pounds of produce. That's just an example. We've had plenty of others from all different kinds of experiences here in Maryland. And so I think anyone can make a huge impact with the right skills, the right background, but also asking themselves some of the questions that we've heard at the symposium today and I brought up.
Okay. Any other panelist wants to take on? We're not going to ask every panelist to answer every question. So if somebody wants to, Matt?
If I can, actually, I was looking towards Lisa because something she said in her remarks during her speech really struck home with me. It's not leaving people behind. And it's who's going to benefit from your research, your technology, your product, your effort. Who's going to actually benefit from it? I know with the drone work that we do, some of the comments we heard earlier today was about how drone technology really started with the military, and there's this perception of drone technology in the military, things like that. One of our specific focus points has been, even some of the work that we do with our military customers, how are other people going to benefit from that technology? What's the dual use of the technology? And it's prevalent across every facet of drone operations. And then to the points of what are the actual missions and application areas that we're going to do with drones, which ones are we going to focus on? And we have kind of gravitated towards disaster prep, disaster response, medical supplies, human organ delivery, things that are actually going to benefit a wide variety of people. And literally 40 minutes ago, I was downstairs talking to a doctor who's working in Zambia. We're going to be doing HIV sample deliveries in Zambia next year with drones. So making sure that the recipients of your technology, the recipients of your effort, are not limited to a privileged group, that it's really going to be applicable across a wide variety. I think that's, to me, what defines the social good aspect.
Okay. Lisa, did you want to say something?
I think this is, we were just discussing this actually, and I think it's a really complicated question, and I think one of the most important things we have to do is admit when we're wrong, and admit when we've done the wrong thing and we need to course correct. A politically sensitive example I can give from my own organization is that we shifted into therapeutic food production. Therapeutic food production saves lives, and I can tell you of all the work that I've done in humanitarian relief, there's nothing sadder than a starving child. It just breaks your heart because it's so preventable. And so therapeutic foods are absolutely necessary, but therapeutic foods are predominantly produced in rich Western countries. They're expensive to produce, they're expensive to ship, they're expensive to store, and they're expensive to deliver. It's completely unsustainable. It sets us up in a situation where people in need us to do things for them. And so we've tried to shift away from that, and now we're trying to develop locally produced therapeutic foods. And what is great is that the base of many of these therapeutic foods is peanuts. And peanuts are easy to grow in many, many countries. And so we're able to create jobs, make sure that foods are sustainable, locally produced. We're strengthening local markets. We're cutting down on carbon emissions by transporting things over shorter distances. So a lot of it is admitting when we haven't done a good job and looking for opportunities to do that work better.
I guess my reaction to this question is, I think this is a really hard question. I'm not arrogant enough to think that I could actually give you an answer. And my sense is that social good emerges from social consensus. And that being the case, I think you have to be willing to keep doing course corrections, but I don't really know what we're up to. I think if you're doing something that I think has the potential to be good and you pay attention to make sure you're not actually doing harm, I think that's the most I can expect.
So following up with this dual-use technology topic, how do you, I guess, reconcile the fact that what you're working on could be used for good, but could be used for not as good? But so, for instance, I'll bring it a little bit more concretely. So a lot of my work is funded by DoD, and some people might argue some of it is meant for not quite as good work. But a lot of that underlying technology and sort of algorithms that we're doing is also directly applicable to a lot of these sort of for good services as well. So how do you reconcile that? And then one step removed from that, what happens? Do you have to foresee 3 steps in the future in terms of what those applications could then be used for with unintended consequences? I'll leave it up to anybody.
So at the risk of speaking out of turn, so my sense is that you have to, in order to make a change, something has to happen, and in order for something has to happen, somebody has to make a profit. As far as I can tell, there's no way around that. Now that may mean that in the short term you may wind up doing some things that are not perhaps ideal. For example, in some of the robotics technology that we developed for helping people recover after stroke, the easy market is the wealthier people, the upper end of the socio-economic spectrum. Now you can say, oh no, we shouldn't do that, we should make this available to everybody. But we can't. In order to get the technology accepted by the clinical community and familiar to the clinical community, we have to put it out there. put it out there, we have to pay for it. To pay for it, we have to go to the people who can actually sign the checks to begin with. So I think it's not a single target, and I think you have to be prepared for non-ideal marketing.
So I'll jump on that, and I feel kind of a little bit like a ringer because I come from a military background and actually worked with Moo on some of her projects too, so I've seen both sides of it. To me, it comes down to mission focus, and the two midshipmen that were here from the Naval Academy, we actually had some great discussions about this earlier. People tend to assume that they know what you're all about if you're wearing the uniform or that you come from a military organization or something like that. You don't, because it really comes down to the mission focus. We can't control policy in the military. We don't control the policy of our civilian leadership. So to go directly to your question, I'll get there. The technology is going to be the technology. We can focus on the uses that we want to focus on. If it's going to be used in other ways, we can't really control that, but we can make sure that it darn well works in the things that we want it to work for. So if we are trying to do human organ delivery, knowing that it could also be delivering a payload of a completely different type, the best thing we can do is make sure that it does the good thing as best we can make it do that today for the right audiences, for the right people that need to use that technology today. There's the counter uses and things like that you can envision what it's going to be used for and develop counters against those technologies, because any good thing is going to be used in a bad way someday. So you can try to envision what those nefarious uses are in the future. But the bottom line is you can't control every use of what your technology is going to be used for. So the best we can do is make sure that it does work for the good things that we know we want it to be used for today.
I'm going to, actually, I think I'll answer the last question, so I'm going to spend a little time on that and then also intertwine your question. Last March, one of our administrators, higher level administrators, passed away. Had been fighting cancer for a long time. And one of the things they always told us is that you do make a difference. And I think our agency does make a difference. We're engaged in all those aspects that have to do with food safety, quality of life, helping people get into professions, this beginning farm and ranch development program, and our ag safety and robotics and how that intertwines. I talked a little bit about that this morning, but I think that's part of the unintended, but also the intended consequences. When you develop systems that are basically alleviate the manual labor, those things they call injuries through ergonomics or whatever it might be, you really are helping people. Particularly when it's cobots. You're not taking away their jobs, you're helping them maximize what they can do, and you're also providing that bottom line that's going to get those things integrated across the agricultural production system. I think the other things we do is, when you think about automation and robotics, one of the things the ag industry has had to deal with for 50 years, we've been telling people don't put your kids on tractors. We're dealing with autonomous vehicles. What kid's going to ride on a tractor that has no seat? It's going to have human protection detection systems. Kids get ran over. So those are the unintended consequences. We're really developing for productivity, but the reality is they're going to help the workplace. But then again, you have some aspects of those that may be unintended that are going to create a more hazardous workplace in terms of technologies we put out there. What you need to do is make sure you have people involved in development of those products that can look at it from all the various angles and think about, okay, have you thought about this, how it might impact basically societal health and safety? So you have to engage a number of people who look at things from a different viewpoint to come up with the best solutions to the problems.
Maybe I'll just add something. I think there's this whole sense of dual use, and I think the points made are so important. But I think, too, we need to be pushing those partners to do more. So the humanitarian space is fraught. It's frankly shrinking, and if we look at the deaths of humanitarian aid workers, it's been increasing year on year. So every year the work that I do becomes more dangerous and humanitarian aid workers are targeted. And some of that is related to military interventions, particularly by the US government, as militaries engage in more humanitarian assistance. It casts a shadow of doubt on neutral aid work. That said, a lot of the work that I've done, I would never have been able to do without US military and other military assistance. The kinds of expertise and equipment they brought to the Nepal earthquake, to the Haiti earthquake, really changed the nature of the response. It allowed us to get our operations up and running much more quickly. It meant we were able to remove debris to create safe places for clinics and emergency medical care. And so I don't ever write off any other partners. Again, I think it's about bringing people together to do the most good that we can. So use those DoD dollars, be subversive, spend it for as much good as you can. And I think we shouldn't say no to anything, but think about how we can change the cultures of the organizations we're working with towards social good.
Okay, great. So, for the audience members, yes, we are going to involve you, so just bear with us for a minute. I just really want to ask this question. This is actually my favorite question, and I have been asking this to a lot of smart people, and I've been getting answers with which I have not been satisfied so far. But I will ask the question after that build up. So, emerging technologies, there's this interesting conundrum when you develop these technologies, right? You want to innovate, right? And you don't want to hold it back. But then regulation sometimes is seen as holding back innovation. But you don't want to allow this laissez-faire type of, let everything go without any control, unbounded growth, versus how do we really also ensure that technology is not just going without any control. So how do you really strike a balance is where I'm getting at. I've heard arguments on both sides. The people I've worked a lot on the standards community side, people say standardization is very important, and then sometimes industry says standardization is holding us back. Really, it's not allowing us to innovate. So both sides argue for both the cases, but I think it's an important question because usually I've always seen this also personally, technology grows much, much faster, right? And then regulation tries to play catch up. And also, the other thing I've used on this, the UAS folks can appreciate this a lot more than I can, especially in the airline industry. A lot of the regulations that have come about have been very reactive. So the Concorde blows up, they start looking at the fuel tanks, try to fix that. So there's so many Challenger, so on and so forth. So the literature is rife with examples like these where it's very reactive. But this is the final point I'll make. With emerging technologies, robotics, AI, we actually may not have a chance to be reactive because this really now is directly being played in the court of public opinion. So if a self-driving car kills somebody, the first reason that's given to the public is because these cars are very safe. They're going to be safer than human drivers. But then we're seeing the Teslas and the Googles and the Waymos of the world crashing and killing people. It's very hard to make an argument that these are in fact safe, and it plays in the court of public opinion, as I said before. And then this has serious implications in funding, congressional hearings, bad opinion, the list goes on and on. So the essential question then is, how do we really do this? How do we strike a balance between controlling regulation and also at the same time not curbing innovation? So it's kind of a long-winded question, but I just wanted to get all my thoughts in there. So anybody who wants to take it.
I'll go ahead and lead off. So the FAA, it was great having Mr. Fleming here earlier talking about his particular, the way he operates within the FAA, because the FAA is an extremely risk-averse organization for darn good reason. We have the safest, busiest airspace in the world. So their approach to it, everything's safety case-based, risk management-based. Their way of doing business is really good for reducing risk. Not so good on moving technology forward. So having individual people that have that risk-based approach, but like to push the envelope where it's either makes sense or where it's allowable. In the case with us, where some of the research operations that we do, finding a few people here that will actually run with scissors in a nice risk-oriented kind of way helps the technology continue to move forward as well as respect the risk-based approach. So I think it's a unique blend, and it's never a clear black line of right and wrong. It's this, I'm going to push it this far, but I'm going to have a risk-based approach to doing it and knowing what my risks are, how I'm managing them, where can I mitigate, where can I eliminate, and then just do it. There are cases where we can just go do stuff because we're doing it in the middle of nowhere, or there's no people around, or it's small enough, or something like that. So I think you really have to identify where you can run as fast as you want, light your hair on fire and just make things happen. And then where are those things like delivering an organ to a person where you really have to have redundancy, reliability, respect for all the regulations, things like that. It's very much of a balancing act all the time.
Anyone wants to add to that?
Well, in a lot of ways, the ag industry is a little different because if you look at the equipment manufacturing industry, they like standardization because it means that their product is compatible with other products. If you're hooking up a tractor with a piece of machinery, you want that standardization. They want to develop that standardization on an international level because that just expands their market. The other thing standardization does is for those that don't comply with the standardization, their products get called out pretty quickly. And usually the standardization has to do with non-adherence to the most safe design and practices. So from their perspectives, for that level, standardization is pretty important to them. So we've probably not ran into as many issues as some of the other industries have.
On the other hand, one anecdote I can relate is a couple of years back, actually it's quite a number of years back, the European Union introduced a safety standard for robots, which required that robots and people be separated by, I think it was by 1 meter minimum distance. This is at the time when we were developing and using safely robots to go in physical contact with humans, delivering therapy that helped them get better after stroke. So by that regulation, we couldn't operate in Europe. Now there are ways around that, but my point is that I think in developing standards and imposing legislation, you really have to be careful about the vision that underlies that standard, the vision that underlies the regulation. The other comment I'd like to make is, I'm not sure that we can't be reactive, and I think you have to look at the time course of development of technology, and I forget whose name is associated with this law, but it's the fact that we tend to grossly overestimate the short-term impact of technology and grossly underestimate the long-term impact. A perfect example of that is mobile telephones, which were around in the 70s and 80s, and big heavy things that made your jacket pulled down too much. But time has to pass until you get somewhere around about the 90s and 2000s, and then that technology takes off, and now we have essentially universal access to the internet through mobile technology. So should we have been worrying about mobile technology back in the 70s and 80s? Or should we wait until it happens in the 90s and 2000s? It's not clear to me that we can't just wait to see what happens. To some extent, excessive legislation ahead of time may not be very effective anyway, and may stop innovation. So I think a bit of humility is required. But I don't think we're smart enough to see what's coming. And I think we have to just be honest about that.
I'm going to change the topic a little bit and address education. So a couple of different questions involved in this big question. What changes or things should we add to the curriculum, and that could be related to college or K through 12, to encourage students to really think about doing good? And then on the sort of related to that question, there are a lot of inequalities within our education system in our country and other countries, but certainly within our country. How do you introduce these types of changes in a way that can benefit all students and not just some of the privileged ones who might have robotics educations in their high school or college campuses?
I feel like I should kick this one off. So I can tell a story about this. When I was working in Cameroon as a teacher, I was there ostensibly as an English language teacher, and I taught in a bilingual high school that taught English as a second language and English as a foreign language. But at the moment that I was there, they were also having a huge spike in HIV/AIDS. And so we wanted to use education systems as a way to convey sensitive information in a mostly Catholic and repressive states on how children can keep themselves safe and teach comprehensive sexual health education without teaching comprehensive sexual health education. And also understanding that the instructional day is much shorter in Cameroon, and we didn't want to shortchange the kids and the core skills they needed in literacy and numeracy. So what we did was we developed a program called Teach English, Prevent AIDS, and Learn English, Prevent AIDS. And so when we were going through standard vocabulary exercises, reading comprehension, all the reading passages were how to keep yourself safe from transmission of HIV/AIDS. And so I think that that's something the universe of information that children need to have now is expanding all the time. So we need to think about how we utilize our core content to reflect these changing social values around being global citizens. I think we need to reorient our civics education so that we're also more cognizant of our place in the world and how connected we are. And that really starts with teachers and with students in the classroom. So it's not just what you teach, it's equally important how you teach. And I think that this ability to understand their ability to impact the world and impact their local communities is really critical, and I spoke a bit about that in my presentation with Kid Power. But I think it's also important to engage students in critical thinking and to, I don't know how your education was, but I know that in some of the countries that I visit, history stops at a certain year because we haven't decided what the story is for everything after that. And I know for myself, it was like World War II and that was it. Everything else was too sensitive, but we need to find ways to have those discussions so that we can have more social cohesion and be able to talk about difference and talk about how we overcome challenges.
I'm gonna actually do what one of the panelists did, which is I'm gonna try to address your question briefly and then also say something about the last question as well. One thing, building on what you said, is that we are in a point now where there's a high interest by young people in wanting to broadly do good, engage in social impact. We're also at a period of time in the United States, for example, where we've actually are hitting all-time lows in people actually engaging in behaviors such as volunteering, giving, doing favors for their neighbors. And so, and societies and communities are very different when less people are engaged with each other, involved with their neighbors. And I think education is one of the key ways to actually tap the high interest that young people have and help them actually make incredible social impacts. But the way to do that is not through one course or one experience, but it needs to be numerous experiences in K through 12 and in college, and hands-on experiences where you're actually applying what you're learning, you're sometimes failing, and you're learning how to adapt from that, and that the opportunities are in the classroom and outside the classroom, so they're open to all students. I mean, students who are asked to try to do good in their spare time, in addition to all their school work, it doesn't work. I mean, it's very hard. Why not provide all the kind of skills about how to do good, because it is not easy to do, in the classroom, and then provide also support so they can do it outside the classroom. So for example, we have something called the Do Good Accelerator here at the University of Maryland. Your full-time summer job can be working on a venture or project with a focus on social impact. Your part-time job during the school year can be working on a project or venture with a social impact. That means you don't have to get another part-time or full-time job to help pay for your education and then try to do good on the side. And so I think that's really important, is that developing kind of innovative curriculum that engages you in multiple experiences that makes doing good kind of a part of your lifestyle. And then the second thing I just wanted to mention about your last question is, I think in the social policy area, and in a lot of other areas, government is typically risk averse, and innovation is a challenging thing for a lot of social kind of impact areas to be supported by the government. There's great examples of that, obviously, in the Defense Department with groups like DARPA, but not so much in the social sector. One of my jobs before I came to the University of Maryland was set up President Obama with some other folks, set up President Obama's Social Innovation Fund, and kind of working on those kind of efforts. There's a number of countries now who are interested in trying to how to drive more social impact, social innovation, but it's hard because people think to themselves, I don't want to say that 90% of taxpayers' money for an innovative effort went to waste, but if it went to waste and 5 or 10% of it produced an incredible innovation, it's worth it. But that's not how we often think about the role of government. But I do think that there is an interest, but there needs to be more in the social policy area of governments, kind of supporting innovation. And to also address kind of some of the private sector issues, we even, with the Social Innovation Fund, we actually had government investing in private foundations, if you can imagine that. So you've got the federal government investing in equivalents of the Gates Foundation, where you're co-investing in efforts that are trying to promote innovations in different areas. So I think there are new public policy models around innovation and the regulation you're talking about, but I still think there's a lot of untapped effort and a lot of untapped opportunity there. And I think it's a challenge of how people perceive government and what's the proper or not proper use of taxpayer money.
So if I get the question right, so we think about how do you instill that basically youth wanting to do good, and how do you do that through education systems. One of the things that we do is what we've done as part of our history is to support the 4-H program, Heart, Head, Health, and I can't remember what the other was. But anyway, it does help in youth development. There's lots of organizations that do youth development. So I think that's one of the things, you get youth involved in things outside the school system. School systems do great stuff, but the reality is they've got so much time that they can devote to those types of things and still provide the curriculum and meet the standards that they're supposed to meet. The other thing I think about in terms of when you get youth at a certain point, and certainly in, there's the foreign exchange things, there's the things where we take students overseas. You get an experience what a lot of the rest of the world is experiencing, and sometimes you're seeing a great deal how advantaged you are. And I think that compassion starts to come through, and it can help guide them through their careers in terms of reaching out and being part of that international community that steps up and helps out.
So this is the last of the questions we wrote down. That basically means you all have been waiting, you're going to get a chance. Depending on what you don't ask or don't, if you don't ask, then I will ask. So please be warned.
No one's getting out.
Okay, this is one of the last things we wrote down. So this is pretty standard question these days, I think. Robots and jobs, right? Get asked everywhere, especially this robotics conference, so you have to ask. So is it hype or is it reality? I mean, my personal take is that people will lose jobs, and anybody who tells you differently is either lying or blissfully ignorant. But the other thing that you don't get to hear, especially from the naysayers, is that the robots will in fact create more jobs than what we might end up losing in the long term. But short term is what catches people's attentions, politicians' attentions, funding cycles, so on and so forth. So it is hard to convince people in the short term that be patient, and I can't make that preaching when they have lost and they don't have money to pay for all the things we need to pay for. So what is your take on it from where you come from? Do you have a solution? Do you think this is hype? Do you think it's reality? How do we deal with this? Or do we not deal with this? Just be quiet.
So I probably shouldn't reach for the microphone so eagerly. So, I mean, I've been involved in robotics in one form or another for quite a while. And back in the 80s, there was a great upswing of interest in robotics, and it was going to solve all the manufacturing problems in the United States. And there were people who were concerned that that was then going to cost us manufacturing jobs. Well, what happened, one of the main things that happened, when you talk to companies who actually installed robots, is that they complained that really all that they did is they changed the color of the workers' collars. They took blue-collar workers and replaced them with white-collar workers because they had to be smart enough to be able to work with the robots. So it's not obvious to me that the net of the sum of all the jobs goes down when you use robots. Now, the identity of the worker may change. The other thing I think is, if I recall correctly, there was a time way back when I was a little boy when we had things called typing pools. You had rooms full of people, usually young ladies, sit in front of typewriters, and their job was to convert scribbled notes into typewritten copy. Well, that job's gone away because we have things now called word processors. So should we attempt to restore that employment opportunity? Or should we realize that what we've done is we've given the writer greater, we've empowered the writer, and we've made a whole lot more people able to write and write well. So it seems to me that the concern about jobs may be a little bit, I'm not sure I'm completely sympathetic with that concern. Similarly, if I go look at, we've been developing robots that can provide a form of therapy and replace therapists. I said, anybody who thinks that has either never had therapy or never seen a robot or both. My sense is, you've got to be kidding. I mean, the expertise embodied in the clinician is far greater than anything that we know how to build into a robot. Instead, the robot is actually a tool to help them do their job. It can do the repetitive bits while they do the thinking bits. So I'm not convinced that there's a problem, but I'm probably biased.
I'd actually like to build on that point. I mean, I obviously have no background in AI or robotics, so maybe not well positioned to speak on this, but I am well versed in allocation of public resources and on how we take care of one another. Having been a teacher and a social worker, there's no shortage of jobs. We don't have enough jobs now. We don't have enough people in elderly care. We don't have enough people in early childhood care. Our classrooms are too large. We don't have social workers in schools. There are so many jobs to be had, and automation could provide an opportunity for us to shift our focus and energies into those services that we do for each other and with one another. There's nothing that can duplicate care, and there's nothing that can duplicate compassion. So I really try to push people away from that kind of fear-mongering. But again, it's about the equitable distribution of resources and thinking about who does those jobs and how we value those jobs. And is it a bunch of ladies sitting in a typing pool? I don't want that job. So how do we formulate jobs for the future in a way that services everyone equally and really advances our core values around children, around taking care of one another.
Well, that's an interesting question because you don't know what the end result's going to be. What we do know, I think I mentioned, social norms, or actually technology does influence social norms. We can see it the way we walk around with cell phones in our ears. And if you think you were transplanted in time to now, you would think the world had gone mad. These people are walking around talking into space, and you don't even know who they're talking to. So they're talking on a cell phone. And sometimes they're, walking their dog, talking and looking at their cell phone. The dog's on a leash, and I'm riding by my bike, hoping I don't hit the dog. So there's lots of things like that go on. But I think there is, technology influences social norms, but social norms determine what technologies are either accepted or rejected, and that has happened throughout history. You go back to Galileo, you go back to all the way back through history, the Royal Academy of Science, all of them were basically challenged by the social norms. We are not there to determine the social norms. What we're there to determine is to help people understand how these technologies work, get rid of basically the misinformation, deal with misinformation about how those technologies can be used in their lives. But in reality, there will probably be more jobs generated in certain areas. Agriculture got small in terms of production because it generated a lot of other jobs that churned the economy. If you think of all the inputs into agricultural production, it's huge. It's a huge amount of the economic engine in terms of whether it's the manufacturing equipment, the insurance, whatever it might be, the banking, all of those aspects go into agricultural production. You fuel that through a very small channel, which is the production itself, and on the back end you have all of the distribution, the processing, the food systems that take place. So it actually creates a tremendous amount of jobs. I see technology robotics helping contribute to that, not necessarily take away from it. You're going to generate some better jobs in rural America. Yes, some people are going to lose jobs, and just like every part of the developed country, you're going to have to retool and retrain if you want to be part of the workforce.
Yeah, I think that last part there is something I'd like to foot stomp on is you have to have long-term vision, but at the same time, short-term consideration, because it is going to affect people. Whether it's elderly workers that are too late to be retrained in their lives or don't want to retrain, whatever those considerations are, there will be opportunities, but it's having that vision and being able to take into account when that happens. We need to plan between here and there on how everybody's going to be brought along, whether it's the people we're serving or the people who are part of the workforce now who maybe do need to get re-educated, retrained, find a new position, a new way to contribute. And maybe the answer is you're never going to do what you do right now ever again. So what else is there that you could do that maybe gets empowered by this new technology? Maybe you're not going to be a mechanic, you're now going to be an analyst, and you're going to be part of the productivity increase. Maybe you're going to be that human touch person that before you were working on the machinery, you knew what the machinery could do. Well, now you're going to explain how that machinery is going to help that individual. You're going to touch that individual. And people sometimes have that change in their lives where that's what they want to do. So it's that short-term consideration, I think, that we need to do at the same time as the long-term vision to make sure everybody comes along at the same time.
Do you have a question or you open up?
I have to sneeze, you can ask
Oh,
questions.
Okay, we'll open up now. The moment you've been eagerly waiting for. Questions from the audience. Either you want to follow up on some of the topics we discussed, or you can start a whole new thread. And as I have warned, if you're too quiet, I will start another thread. You have one? Okay. I nominate you.
Which one?
No?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I came in a little bit late, sorry guys. Did some work for school, but including an exam. But if it hasn't been touched on before, I was wondering if I could just kind of get a read on a definition of what is good, and then also what is not good. Because I think that it's very easy to just like, boop, like this is like a good application, and not really consider like what it plays into and what it's not playing into, like, and what it's actually affecting. I don't know. I just kind of want to hear from people who are doing a lot of this work, like, what do you really define as good in terms of like doing good?
I think you came a bit late.
Came a bit later. I already got
So that was the very first question.
First question, I figured. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Okay, passing it on.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my question is not like good or not. My question is, what is humanity or good? So I think those are just two different things. So, I mean, what I can see is that we're talking about good, right? Good can be like very broad. But in humanity, if you think about like the basic human nature, so what is just like bothers me is that how can we use robotics, for example, to address like a very long-term, impact? For example, like if we just think about maybe a global warming, right? So what happened if the coastal areas got flooded? So we have to just like move people from coastal areas to the mainland. So then we lose the land for farming. Then what's going to happen? So and also that's actually not a dream, right? So it's happening. The ice is melting, right? So every year, changing, like we kind of like see very dramatic change of the environment. So I mean, those things, if we think about, so those are not like within our lifetime maybe, but it's probably just our children, right? So it's going to affect our children. So what are we going to do, like, as this generation to affect the future generations? So that's my question.
I don't think there's any good answers for that,
Yeah,
but
I know.
it does come down
I mean,
to
that's just bothering
it comes
me,
down
right?
to a social conscience, and basically, at some you're really looking at how do you value and what value and what priority you put on future generations and what you're leaving them with, and we should all have a good social conscience. We should all be in tune to that. A lot of what we see in terms of our debt and other factors and climate, we're not doing everything we should be doing. I mean, that's the reality. And I don't know how you change that. We all know it, but we're not changing.
I don't know how many of you have been striking on Fridays. I strike. And I was really fortunate last week during the UN General Assembly to be there with Greta. I found her so inspiring. I was with other adults and I was like, oh, we messed up. If we had been half as good as Greta, we wouldn't be in the situation that we are now. I'm really inspired by young people and their drive for change. I think about Malala. I think about all these young people who've really, use their platform to call for action and have built their lives around making a difference. And I think we all have that opportunity in our circles of influence, and so I think it's really about maximizing that. One of the students, I was attending a poster presentation, she was like, I don't even want to do this now, I feel bad. Why did I use all my time doing this? I could have been doing something that had more, social impact. And that is really discouraging to me because we don't know what all the good applications of that research is going to be yet. It may have multiplier effects that you don't anticipate, as we've talked about with other technologies. But also, it's not too late. I mean, she can change, and we can all change. We can go from military careers to academic careers. I shifted from a domestic focus to an international focus, but I think it's really about instilling that drive to do good in students and helping them think about how they want to orient their lives and orient their research in that way. And I think the more we can encourage that kind of thinking and think about, again, how we work together with different kinds of people, I think it's not too late to make changes and to change people's attitudes about the difference they can make. I think the most important thing is to reinforce that we do make a difference and every choice we make makes a difference, so let's make it count.
And if I could build on that, I think inspiration is good, but we also have to invest a lot in providing opportunities for young people inside and outside of education with groups and others that really supports them to actually make an impact. And we need to recognize that young people and adults, there are a lot of barriers to trying to make a social impact. And we have to think about what are ways that we can make it easier to make a social impact. I mean, one of the books that I love, and we actually teach in some of our Do Good Now classes, is a book called Switch. And it's basically, about how can you create change when change is hard. And any of the big issues we're talking about here, they're hard, right? It's not maybe that a lot of people aren't interested in making a difference in these kind of issues, no matter what their age, but it's hard to make those changes. So I think we need to think about how can we make things easier. One of the great examples I think of that, the last thing I'll give, is recycling. If I asked you how many people here are passionate about recycling, how many people raise their hand? 1, 2, 3. Okay. I mean, it's a decent size of the room. All right. I bet when I do this in a class and I ask people what are the three issues you're most passionate about, few people say recycling. How many people all recycle? Right? How many people recycle? Almost everyone, right? Because it's fairly easy, right? It's easy. Like in a campus building, for example, there are numerous places in the same floor that you can easily recycle. My 12-year-old, right, is going to ask questions if I'm not recycling, right? Because we've made it easy to do, right? So with a lot of other social challenges, we got to think about how can we create opportunities that really support people to make an impact, and also how can we reduce barriers so that change is easier for people to achieve.
And I'd say there's two aspects in particular that really come to mind on this. One is, it goes hand in hand, I think, with what both of you mentioned, is incentivize. What do we incentivize? What do our systems incentivize? Whether it's our work, our academia, our government, what activities, what behaviors are they incentivizing to going to the point of making it easy? Whether it's incentivizing by making it physically easy, or money, or getting ahead, whatever it is. But one thing that I'd really like to come down on hard somewhat is accountability. We don't hold ourselves accountable. We don't hold each other accountable. A few of my fellow panel members here will remember the 60s and the 70s. The dawn of the age of Aquarius, and we were enlightened and we became aware of all these evil things that were going on. So why did that generation become the generation that's in charge right now, that everybody's pointing their fingers at, and all the problems that we've had? What happened? They didn't hold themselves accountable. They didn't hold each other accountable. That's leadership. Personal leadership, holding yourself accountable. The leadership in your community, holding each other accountable. We knew what the problems were. We knew what could happen. But we chased other things and forgot about all the things that we knew were the right things to do. So I think accountability is a piece that we have to somehow keep in mind and instill in, like you said earlier, the education with our youngest children. It's also about accountability. Awareness is great. We have instant hyper-awareness now with the internet and everything else that we have worldwide that we never had before. But we also have to instill that you're accountable for what you do. You're accountable for your actions, and you're each responsible for each other too. So I think that's a big piece that will prevent us from having bigger problems in the future, but also to get towards, like you said, it's fixable now, but you have to start with recognition that here's the problem. Let's hold each other accountable to fix that problem.
Sorry, I just have to add one more thing. I just think, you know, too, it's like really about our spheres of influence. And when I think about the behaviors that we signal, one thing we do at UNICEF is that we send out a message saying that we're turning down the temperature or turning up the temperature in our building. People complained like crazy, but we've also like banned plastic water bottles, and anyone who has a contract with us can't deliver plastic water bottles. So you cannot buy plastic water bottles at any event at UNICEF. And that sends a message and it starts to change the culture. So it's all of those small decisions we make at an operational level, at an administrative level, at a personal level, that I think really start to shift the culture. And so we need to think about how we do that at every level in which we have influence.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question. This is a little bit controversial, but it's, I think, very fresh on people's minds. And in fact, we just wrote an opinion piece. It's going to come out in the Untitled Robotics Automation magazine in December. This is about taking money, so your sources of funding, if you will. Many of you have recently heard about the Epstein case. MIT Epstein case, I think most of you know, particularly the academics know. So it was very controversial. I mean, this was kind of looking back, it's hindsight is 2020 kind of a problem. So just for people who don't know, Epstein was recently, well, he committed suicide, but he was recently convicted. He was recently convicted this time and was convicted a long time ago for doing things I don't want to repeat here. But then he had also funded a lot of folks in MIT, and there was a cover-up. And Ito, who was the MIT Media Lab director, he ended up resigning because there was an institution-wide cover-up. It became extremely controversial, and there are people who say, oh, we couldn't have done anything because we didn't know this was a bad actor, and we took the funding because we didn't know anything. So the first part of the question is, do we really have to be aware about where we get our funding? That's one part of it. The other part of it is, how many of you know this Google Maven project? So this is a project, this was actually something Google ended up pulling out of because there was a lot of controversy within the company, so they ended up pulling that. So basically that's, Google promised to do the Pentagon something, and there was a lot of backlash within the company, and they ended up pulling out of it. Again, this is a funding source problem. So my question is, as people who are beneficiaries of funding from different sources, academics and otherwise, what is our responsibility from where we take our funding from? But I personally worry also because by taking money from, let's say, and I'm not going to point the hand at military, but I'm just going to use it as an example for argument's sake. If we take money from a particular source, in a way, actually, we are legitimizing what they're doing. Because let's say DARPA funds a particular project, cool project, because DARPA always looks at high-risk, high-payoff projects. People take money, there are a lot of good things come out of it, internet, self-driving cars, the list goes on. But then we really don't have control, and this goes back to the dual-use technologies issue that we were talking about before. But we do have a part, implicit or otherwise, because when we do the research taking that money, we are part of the solution of the problem, whatever the case may be. So it's not very easy to just say, in the past, it looked good, we took it. But I think we need to make a very conscientious effort right now, given all these examples that are coming up, and where we take the funding from. So I would really like to hear, like, for example, from Neville, who is also from MIT. So maybe you can share from your experience and wisdom. I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I just remembered when I looked at you. So can you talk about it? Where personal experience or otherwise, what your feeling is on this, where we take our funding, what is our responsibility?
So I can only give you a personal opinion, and I don't have a whole lot of specialized inside knowledge. I must confess, I waver back and forth between two positions. One extreme is to say, look, I don't really care where the money came from. If I'm going to do good with the money, that's actually going to be, if my use of the funds will wind up being socially beneficial, I don't think that's a bad idea. On the other hand, I think the strong negative is if by accepting funds, say from Epstein, we either directly or indirectly endorse Epstein and Epstein's actions. That's not good. So so those are two opposites. So where do you draw the line in between them? Should we never take funding from DoD? Personally, I disagree with it. I don't know how other people feel, but I think we still need an active modern military. I think the world is not a friendly place. And I think it's a good thing that we have dedicated people who go into the armed services, and I want to give them the best equipment they have. If that means that the robotics that we develop may be optimized to kill people, well, unfortunately, that's the reality of the world we live in. At the same time, the better we make that, for example, say with drone technology, the drone technology does have civilian uses that aren't purely for lethal purposes. So I don't think there's a simple answer. I think if I'm going to do well with the funding, I don't think I should refuse it unless, by accepting the funding, I'm going to promote something that I would really rather not promote. That was a non-answer.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely not a simple answer to us, and we've had some experiences with this, with some of the projects that have come to us. We've said no to certain projects, not so much based on the source of the money as much as the traceability of what the product was going to be used for. The ones that we have said no to, we either knew or could reasonably determine that the technology and the product that we were going to produce was going to be used for something that we didn't want to be part of, we didn't want to support. And I won't go into specifics of which countries they were, what the uses were, but pretty clearly they were not do good. And they were pretty clearly not in the interest of the University of Maryland. And kind of my litmus test is, if it comes out in the paper, thank you, Robert, if it comes out in the paper, University of Maryland did this project for this customer to do this purpose. If in my mind says, oh, that's going to look bad on Sunday morning, then we would probably look not to do that kind of thing. But it comes back to traceability of the product, but also in some sense, traceability back to the source. If it's a very broad source like DoD, that does a lot of good things for a lot of good purposes, but has been used in bad ways at times too, you got to weigh that out. If it comes down to a very, very pinpoint source of money that is not acting in people's best interest, acting in their own personal interest or for their own profit, that may not be aligned with humanity, with the do good purpose, then you got to look at that a second time. But it's definitely not a clear cut black and white all the time.
So all that said, I think, again, personal opinion, not any position at MIT. For me, the thing that was really damning about Joe Ito's actions was the fact that there was a clear attempt to anonymize the donations and cover up. That suggests that somebody realized that this was not a source that they would like to have advertised in the Boston Sunday Globe. And I think that's a good litmus test.
Maybe I'll just add, UNICEF accepts money from a lot of places, but we do draw the line with certain organizations that have engaged in egregious human rights violations or environmental degradation. But being part of the UN family, I mean, you can look at the governments that are on the Human Rights Council. These are not champions of human rights. And so there's a lot of diplomatic space that we have to negotiate, and we are trying to get money to do as much good as possible. And in many of the countries in which we work, countries face a resource curse, and extractive industries are the largest industries that are employing the most people, that are generating the most revenue, but also causing the most damage. So again, I think it's really important about how we work with them to change their practices and be cognizant of the work that they're doing. Some of our worst violators of children's rights are armed groups, but they're also the same people that deploy in peacekeeping forces to protect children and protect communities. So how do we train armed groups to respect children's rights, to respect women's rights, to work with us on reporting and accountability mechanisms? I think this concept of accountability is so important. And even though we're not really a funding agency, I was really touched by an article that I read recently by the director of the Ford Foundation, who's a gay black man, and has talked about how he has so much money at his disposal, and he really uses this as an opportunity to engage in almost reparations, and understanding that his corporate industry has made all this money that they have to give by hurting lots of people, and how can they start to right those wrongs through conscientious social giving and through the Ford Foundation, and that is just one step in the right direction.
I was just want to underscore the comment you made about this question not being an easy one. It's interesting because it's actually a question. I come from a field of philanthropy, for example, which is this is an often commonly debated issue. In fact, one of my mentors used to joke the only problem with tainted money is there ain't enough of it. But basically arguing that, within reason, I think there are a lot of good reasons why you should turn down money if it doesn't fit with your mission. But also, a lot of times you could have problems with all kinds of funders. But to illustrate, if you believe that you can really make a real impact and do some good with it, and it isn't directly countering the mission you're doing, or in some way elevating someone that you're very uncomfortable with, then maybe you should think about taking it. But I'd like to flip one question that I have the benefit of somebody's teaching about fundraising. And I think often, and I also have worked as a grant maker, and I think often as grant makers, they say, well, how do I select an organization, either in the government or in a private foundation, that carefully, right? So I pick which organization I want to select carefully. I actually think it's the flip for many of us. I actually teach a lot that you should choose your funders carefully. And that the best kind of efforts are where you find funders that have strong alignment with your mission and your work and your partners together. And you actually are in the car or you're side by side and you are looking to achieve the same thing together. And so I think what you often should do is really be choosing your funders carefully. And if you do that, you'll end up, I think, making a bigger impact because funders and you are so much closely aligned, and are actually trying to achieve the same outcome together and are partners in trying to achieve that.
Let me add one other comment. This is related to from which agencies or companies should we accept funding. There's a strong student-led movement to divest from oil companies, funding from oil companies, because it's like, we're fighting the fire, they're feeding the flames. So one of the concerns with that is that if you think that we can do without oil, I think that's naive. If, on the other hand, you think that we could affect the oil companies, then we should stay engaged with them. If we divest from them, we've just closed that door. So I think it's not trivial to be able to. We can attempt to be, pure as driven snow, and we accept no money from the coal and oil industry. Fine, but that's not necessarily going to change their behavior. Whereas if we stay engaged, we may have the opportunity to at least nudge the ship a little bit in the right direction.
I think we have a question.
Keeping in this vein of discussion, since it's been open, there are certain things and programs and funding resources at the University of Maryland that certainly should be better looked at and evaluated in a fair and open-minded type of manner. And also the ethics of those who have provided significantly funded. While there have been some financing from certain government agencies that purposely are very secret and provide some good resources for hopefully good uses of national security, there is certainly a policy at the University of Maryland. I'm not exactly sure how it's worded, but it definitely does not allow funding from in secret of military-funded endeavors at research at the university itself. Though there are ways to actually go around this by funding off-campus, such as at the research park being built. This certainly should, I would say, that it should be looked upon as let's have some clear light on this. We're not necessarily rejecting it, but we shouldn't keep it in secret. There are also private funders from several different private funders who provided many millions of dollars to the University of Maryland. The Koch brothers funds a program at the business school. Amway family funds a program at the Performing Arts Center. I don't believe Amway is really a very ethical business, so you could have an argument either way on that. Also, recently in 2008, with the collapse of certain financial institutions in the U.S. in the housing area, Countrywide Mortgage, which while it did definitely seem to present a type of financing to those who needed more financing for their that were struggling and wanted to have their own single-family house. Countrywide, as it was administered, was not ethical at all. But those who were alumni of Countrywide have finance programs through the business school too, in a way that I believe is not very ethical. These are things that have happened at University of Maryland. Who's going to actually look into things that have happened here in a fair and balanced method, but presenting clear light to such matters?
So, Bob, you're the only person on the panel from the University of Maryland.
I'm not sure if I'm going to be announced.
Yeah, I think let's not point fingers at any particular beneficiary. We're just talking generally what we can take and what we cannot take. But certainly, you have concerns, you have raised them. Panel is not willing to answer. I'm certainly not qualified to answer this.
I can say something.
Okay.
I mean, I'm really impressed by the movements by young people to take the names off of problematic people on buildings and not hold them in places of honor that they don't deserve. And I certainly would encourage that kind of continued student activism. I think it's critical and important to healthy public discourse and recognizing the wrongs in the past. Recently, we had a scandal at UNICEF. In fact, there was an executive from Save the Children who had engaged in egregious sexual harassment and exploitation and been fired. And we hired him in a promoted position within an organization. But staff mobilized to say that we completely objected to that decision, and he was let go. The conditions under which he was not let go were not ideal. But I think that it's really upon all of us to call our institutions to account, because what is an institution? It's only the people that make it up. And so we have to set the tone, we have to set the challenge to hold our administrations accountable, to hold our colleagues accountable. I think, again, going back to this word of accountability is critical, and understanding, again, that each of us has a voice and power to create change. And so how do we create institutional cultures that we can support and that advance our values?
I don't know what the time is, but I think we're going to have to wrap it.
I guess I would just like to point out, we're kind of talking a big game about accountability, but I think when we start naming names, that's where accountability actually comes in. So we can't just talk about this in theoreticals. Like, I haven't seen a serious analysis of, like, within the engineering department, certainly at UMD, of, like, thinking about the ethics of where the funding comes from. Nobody, I mean, on a structural level, has taken it seriously. And I think, like, in order to do that, we have to, like, name the names and, like, not just, like, take this as some sort of intellectual sort of exercise. So I'll just put that there. Like, I definitely think it's going to take serious, like, challenging of these institutions. And then also, I would say, to divestment, that's kind of the only power we have. Like, they're not going to, change because we told them to. The power we have over corporations is, like, the money that we give them, and, like, the credence that we give them in our society. So I don't really know any other way to, like, make these people move besides, like, cutting them off.
Well, but cutting them off from what? So the influence that we have is that we're producing. So the main product of NIT is people. And I think that by keeping the companies have an interest in staying engaged with MIT precisely because of that. If we divest, we have no influence on them. One of our sources of influence is to have our people lined up as their employees. So I think the matter is not as simple as the only thing we can do is take our reputation away. I'm not sure that if we were to divest from, say, Chevron, I'm not sure that would make that much difference. That's a large company.
Seems better than sending students to work for them.
Say again?
It seems better than sending people to work for them.
I'm not sending people anywhere. People choose to go work for them. And if they choose to go work for them and they've had the ethical, they've had an ethically oriented education, which I think we try to give them, then I think that's at least influencing them in the right direction. Can we track that? That's very difficult. I think the one point that you made, I think is really important. That is, I think one thing that I think we can easily agree on is transparency, that we shouldn't hide sources. So, you might not agree that we should get funding from Chevron. I have colleagues who think we should, but I think at a minimum there should be no secret about that. And another thing is that transparency can not only be in terms of about the source of the funding, but about what the destination of the funding is. What are we using it for? So, for example, I was involved in a research project a small project funded by Chevron, and it was to develop robotics to help retrieve from the ocean floor the non-functional. They set up these drilling rigs in the deep ocean. They only run for a finite number of years, and then they want to take them out of there. And this is a good thing, but it's difficult to do because it's robotic. So we're looking at using robots at depths which would be hazardous for humans. So they were actually spending money to try to figure out how to dismantle these oil installations at something initially at about 1,000 meters depth, but they're thinking all the way down to 5 kilometers. So that's a tough challenge. I like the idea of working on that. And okay, if Chevron's not the least tainted of funding sources, but it didn't seem like a bad idea to me.
Okay. Do the panelists have questions?
Right, I was going to
fellow panelists.
Well, I was going to ask another question, but I was just going to address this question of deciding what sources you want to or not. I mean, I think it's a more challenging question because one of the values, I think, I'm going to just talk about philanthropic dollars, is that it exists in many ways in the United States for one or more individuals' view of the social good at the time. And being in the minority of a viewpoint can actually be a positive in the future. So, for example, if we would have went into the 19th century, a very small number of philanthropic dollars went to support efforts for abolitionists to fight slavery. And if you had said, well, what are the common values of the time? We shouldn't allow that kind of philanthropy. Then we wouldn't have had any kind of funding supporting efforts that now none of us would say we would oppose. And so I think there's one of the great values of philanthropic efforts is it often promotes new ideas, new perspectives, groups that sometimes are marginalized or ideas that are marginalized. And so I think that's what makes it a little bit more challenging to say, I want to take this kind of funding, but not that kind of funding, because in some ways, different perspectives I think are very valuable, particularly at an educational institution. And also what you might view as something that you don't agree with, isn't it also, depending on what it is, value to have diverse perspectives being presented at an institution? So I think it's just more difficult, and I think there is some value to historically the role that philanthropy has played. Not that I'm saying it's all positive, but I do think that there's real value as well to bringing different diverse perspectives that it sometimes brings. And it's not all super wealthy individuals. Many of the philanthropists who funded abolitionists, they weren't super wealthy individuals.
I think let me pick up on that. One of the things that I've noticed is that I have a little interaction with academia in Europe. And one of the things that I notice is that, as far as I can tell, it's a uniquely American phenomenon, this notion of sort of, quotes, giving back, end quotes, to the school that may have influenced your education. As far as I know, that's very rare in Europe, and it's a badge of honor in the US. I mean, people compete to give money to places like Harvard. And it's one of their measures of success. I think that's not a bad thing, especially if we're not receiving that.
So I'm really glad. I've been sitting here thinking this whole time since you said that about the accountability piece, because I kind of kicked that ball into the court. We each have a personal role in that accountability, and it starts with us. What do we hold ourselves accountable for? Then what are we willing to hold our family members, our community members, our faculty members, our team members accountable for? The people that we give our money to, the people that we take money from. How far are we willing to go in that accountability? And it even, I think, draws back to the whole purpose of or half the purpose of the conference, not the do good part, but the robotics part. How much are we willing to give to robotics? How much responsibility, how much ethics are we willing to hand over to robotics? For years, everybody said, well, as long as we obey the 3 laws of Isaac Asimov, we're okay. Well, we quickly found out that there's a lot of permutations under there and sub-rules and everything else. Ultimately, it comes down to how willing are we? And it's us as individuals, but also as society, a free society. We're willing to hold people to certain levels of accountability that a non-free society isn't even allowed to do. We'll make mistakes with that. We have made mistakes with that. But the fact that we're willing and able to do it gives us freedom, but also gives us responsibility. So I think it's a huge, just ball of wire of question there. But I think the fact that we think about it is that these days start. We may not get it right 100% of the time, we may not get it right 50% of the time. But the fact that we are thinking about it, at least as a start, rather than just saying, well, somebody else will take care of that. So I think the fact that of the presentations I saw today, Lisa just made my mind burn and hurt and get screwed up. Just thinking about the possibilities of what are we really accountable for? What difference can we really make? You can. And it starts locally, but it's a whole cliche, think globally, act locally. But it's true. And just brought it home to me, and I'll stop with this, is people talk about their role models and famous people, and parents say, my role model is my now 20-year-old daughter, who was 12 or so when I first started talking about it. She got me by every part of my being when she told me after a certain series of events happened, Dad, you've never disappointed me more in your entire life. That will make you think. So things that will make us stop and think, am I doing the right thing? That's what we have to answer right here, and then look around to everybody else that we touch, and who can we influence, spheres of influence. Who can we influence, whether it's about robotics, or who we're taking money from, or humanity and do good. Who can we influence today the way we want to influence them?
I would add another point is that it's very easy in these conversations to focus on negative things, like, well, you should not do this or not do that. And of course, there's merit to that. I think there's value to turning it around and saying, well, what can I do positively? What are the things that I might do that could have a positive social benefit? And okay, I agree with you, we'll probably make mistakes. We always have in the past. But I think it's important to get in there and do things and try to make social good. Fixing it doesn't work.
Okay. I was thinking how to conclude, and I think you gave me a great idea to conclude. And I'm going to contradict myself, so I will start with that. So, Do Good Robotics Symposium, Do Good is very meaningful for us at UMD because it's our first Do Good campus, as you first heard. For me, Do Good also has a different meaning in the sense, Google's motto, for example, is don't be evil, right? So it's a double negative. But do good is a straight up affirmative, positive, be very straight, no confusion there, no shades of gray, right? So I really like do good. But here comes the contradicting part. This is how I would like to conclude given the time. I'm actually going to ask the panelists to say one thing which you think that robotics would rather not do in, say, the coming years. I don't know, you pick your horizon, 5 years, 10 years. Just one thing that you would have robotics not do. Not what it would do. We've been talking about what to do, but let's think what not to do. Can you just quickly go through the list? I know I kind of cut it off guard maybe, but just whatever comes to your mind, let's just conclude on that. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to start as the most untechnical person on the panel, which I want to take that, is I think for robotics to not be serious about paying close attention to the unintended consequences of all its work. To me, I think that's a really important thing.
And for me, that's a very easy question to answer. We get a lot of pressure from big tech companies to move to online learning, and a lot of people think that online learning is the way of the future, and in all these poor contexts, people can just study on their own on the internet. That's not why we go to school. We go to school to learn how to get along with one another, how to follow rules, how to help each other, how to cultivate compassion. So when we invest in education, we have to invest in people first.
So I guess one of the things that I'd like not to see is to have robotic technology develop to the point where we have opposing armies exclusively in combat from machine to machine with no humans involved.
Well, you're asking me this right off the top of my head. I think one of the things I would like robotics not to do is make them so human in appearance. I think that creates risk for the industry in terms of acceptance.
And I think my answer is kind of the summation of the other answers here. It's don't remove the humanity. We are humans and we relate with other humans for very good reasons. Anything that we do to replace the humanity, I think, is a mistake. And to go to the point of the military background or the humanitarian missions, the real do-good missions, there needs to be human face. One of my favorite phrases I use in my outreach all the time is, there's very little unmanned in unmanned aviation. The tools are unmanned, but they darn well better have a human reason and a human behind them that's driving. So don't remove the humanity.
All right, fantastic discussion. I'm sorry if I spoke too much, but I'm a curious guy. You will excuse me. Let's thank the panelists. I want to thank Mumu for co-chairing the panel session. Thank you. That does it for me. Thank you again. And I'm going to turn it over to Meow to do the final one.
All right. I think first, I would like to say that this is a wonderful experience for me for the 2 days. I don't know how you feel, but just like, this is like almost like something that I've never experienced before, especially when I listened to like Lisa's talk this afternoon. So I think my heart was like melting. I told you, right? So anyways, I would like to thank all the keynote speakers from yesterday and today, and also all the invited lunch speakers, and also all the technical presenters, and also the startup competition teams and judges, and also the panelists this evening. I think also I would like to thank everybody here who participated in this first ever Do Good Robotics Symposium. I don't know what we can actually take home from this two-day symposium, but what I'm thinking about is we should actually do good together. So we should actually stay as a community. So that's what we're going to do. After the symposium, we're going to actually share with everybody the participant list. So I think we should actually do things together as a community, and also try to influence other people as well. So this way, we can actually have this community grow. Eventually, I think we can all do something good. All right, so I'm not going to say too much because this is Friday evening. I think everybody's tired after this kind of very intense 2 days. Thank you so much for your participation, and safe travels for those who need to.